So I want to welcome you all to the Alden Barn and a very special presentation that we have to offer you today by Patrick Browne, whom I first met as a Civil War soldier. So who knew? Who knew that
it was 1862.
It was 1862. Who knew he could go back 100 years? A man of many talents. Now I know formally the director of the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society and the Pilgrim Hall Museum. So let's see, that covers the 19th century, the 17th century, and here we are in the 18th century. With this story of the almost Battle of Marshfield that Patrick had researched and wrote about. He's now a PhD student at Boston University. So without further ado, Patrick, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I am always happy to talk about some Duxbury history. And in honor of Liberty Pole Day here at the Alden House, I thought it would be appropriate, and Desiree asked me to speak about Duxbury in the years leading up to the war. And of course, you can't talk about Duxbury and leading up to the Revolutionary War without talking about the almost Battle of Marshfield, which is what I've sort of dubbed it. It was very nearly a battle. So what I'd like to do is run through the really tumultuous circumstances. I mean, the entire colony, of course, was in tumult, but here there was a lot going on, and particularly in Marshfield and in the towns around Marshfield, there was great agitation and a lot of conflict going on because Marshfield, as you may know, and if you don't, it's important that you know because it's a major theme throughout this whole talk. Marshfield was mainly a Tory town, and if Tory being loyalists or supporters of the king. So we're going to talk a good deal about that. And the fact that Tory was really such a strong, Marshfield was such a stronghold of loyalism really created a lot of tension and conflict in the towns around here. So that's a little bit about what I wanted to be telling you about today. Of course, when it comes to the start of the Revolutionary War era around here, things are really driven by Boston. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about are, developments in Boston and then how that filtered down here and how that affected the environment down here. And you have to start with the Stamp Act, of course, 1765. I won't roll through all the list of parliamentary action that led to the Revolutionary War. It's all very complicated with this act and that act and this act. But I'm going to mention a couple of them at least because they had direct impact here. One, of course, being the hated Stamp Act of 1765. The idea was the British government was basically hurting for money, needed to raise funds in order to pay off their debts related to the French and Indian War that ended in 1763. And in order to raise these funds, they turned to the colonies and decided to start taxing the colonies. One of the first taxes that they implemented was the Stamp Act, or the stamp tax, and basically what this was is you had to have an official stamp in order to make these certain documents official. The cost of the stamp varied depending upon how important the document was, and this went for almost everything: newspapers, legal contracts, official documents, deeds, even decks of cards were sold with a stamp on them. And again, the cost could range anywhere from a shilling to, for something like a legal contract, to £10. And in Boston, there were major protests, indeed riots in Boston, protesting the Stamp Act, which eventually led to its repeal. And you get the Liberty Tree becomes a thing in Boston during the Stamp Act protests. They hung representatives of Parliament in effigy from the Liberty Tree, and this was the start of Liberty poles and in some towns Liberty trees being put up around the province of Massachusetts Bay. Duxbury did not put up their Liberty pole at this time. I'll get to that. But in Boston, you had the Liberty tree going where the Sons of Liberty would meet around the Liberty tree, and they'd have protests there. Do people know the site of this now? Anyone familiar with that? It's right in downtown Crossing. Does not look like this today, not very much at all. Right at the corner of Washington and Essex Street downtown. And there's a big building there now, but a big wooden sign on that building says "Site of the Liberty Tree." So at least it's marked, and that's good. There were in Duxbury, and by the way, I should mention. I should mention that this is going to have sort of a Duxbury focus because here we are in Duxbury at the John Alden House. So I'm looking at these events sort of from a Duxbury point of view. In Duxbury, there were no Stamp Act riots. There were no massive protests in Duxbury during the Stamp Act. But there was a tremendous celebration when the Stamp Act was repealed. And that took place on Captain's Hill in 1766. And Captain's Hill did not look like that at the time. The Miles Standish Monument was not there, obviously. That didn't come along till more than 100 years after the Revolutionary War. But A, I like this photo, and B, it gives you an idea of how treeless the landscape was at that time. This is 19th century, of course, but I think in 18th century it was just as devoid of trees. So in Duxbury, this celebration, they hauled 2 cannon up to the top of Captain's Hill, expended half of the town's gunpowder supply and just blowing off that cannon in celebration, which doesn't seem to me like to be a very prudent thing to do, but that's all right. A little expensive. They hung 2 British lords in effigy, and everybody just had a grand old time. But that repeal was really the beginning of, certainly in Boston, and also to a lesser extent in Duxbury and the towns around here, of the Sons of Liberty kind of taking hold, again, definitely in Boston, but the notion of liberty and protest taking hold here in Duxbury. Well, as you roll along, tensions, of course, increase. Again, this is mainly driven by Boston's protests to the various taxes and parliamentary acts that are passed down. You get taxes on paper, on lead, on glass, and on tea, of course. These known as the Townshend Acts in 1767, and great protests in Boston leading to troops finally being placed in Boston, occupy Boston in May of 1768. So Boston is an occupied town as of 1768. And some of those troops that came in 1768, they would be there right through evacuation day 1776. So some of those regiments were in Boston for a long, long time. You get an increasing polarity going on between Tories and Patriots, more commonly known as Whigs during the day. We would call them Patriots now, I'll call them both. But Patriots and Tories in Boston and Marshfield, and then of course you get the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770. And you know, we're pretty much at the point of no return after that point. People start talking about revolution. People believe that Boston, after the Boston Massacre, is when Sam Adams really started talking about independence that early in 1770. Duxbury in 1773. I don't want to quite talk. I'm almost to the Marshfield Tea Party, but Duxbury in 1773 kind of cast its lot. They had a town meeting to address the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which was headed up by Sam Adams and his friends. The Boston Committee of Correspondence sent a letter to all towns throughout the province of Massachusetts Bay, basically recounting all these horrible things that the British government was doing. And will you support us in the town of Boston? We are, in fact, let me just go back. You know, they're saying we're here, we're under occupation, redcoats are landing in Boston. To towns in Massachusetts, will you support us? Will you get behind us? Will you support the Patriot cause? So it's a yes or no answer. And that letter goes to Duxbury. Duxbury has a town meeting to decide. They're going to vote on this, yay or nay. Are we going to support Boston? The answer was yes, absolutely, we support you. And I just want to read a bit. This letter, we believe, was written mostly by George Partridge, who was a very influential fellow in town at that time. In responding to Boston, he said, "We, the freeholders and other inhabitants of the town of Duxbury, meeting legally assembled upon due examination of the contents of a pamphlet from the town of Boston, which gives us the distressing and very alarming apprehensions that a plan is laid and prosecuted with unrelenting vigor, which will, if thoroughly completed, reduce the colonies and this province in particular to a state of vassalage and desperation. We inherit the very spot of soil cultivated by some of the first comers to New England, and though we pretend not that we inherit their virtues, yet we hope we possess at least some remains of that Christian and heroic virtue and manly sense of liberty. We glory in a legal, loyal subjection to our sovereign, but when we see the right to dispose of our property claimed and actually exercised by a legislature 1,000 leagues off, and in which we have no voice, and ships and troops poured in upon us to support the growing, or rather overgrown power of crown officers, we esteem it a virtue and a duty to oppose tyranny in all forms." So that's, yeah. So there's Duxbury in 1773 talking about liberty, tyranny, all those key words, and that's as early as 1773. Duxbury raised a minute company in 1773, which is interesting. That's earlier than most towns. A lot of towns didn't do that until 1774. A minute company, every town had its militia. Just standard law, every town had to have a company of militia, going way, 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 way back. Minute companies were formed and organized in times of distress, of alarm, of urgency. So a minute company was literally supposed to be ready on minutes' notice, ready to go and assemble to deal with whatever crisis there was. So the fact that Duxbury forms a minute company as early as 1773 is significant. As I say, that's fairly early. The first captain of that minute company was in Alden, was Captain Ichabod Alden. He actually got promoted up the line, and George Partridge took over as captain of the minute company. And other officers, Briggs Alden becomes major of the Plymouth County Regiment. He would eventually become lieutenant colonel of the Plymouth County Regiment. Judah Alden in 1773, becomes ensign of the Duxbury Minute Company. He would eventually become a lieutenant during the war. And he rose to major during the war.
Major in the line company later.
Yeah. All right. Well, of course, we get in December 16, 1773, the Boston Tea Party. I'm not going to go into all the details of the Boston Tea Party. You pretty much know the story, right? They throw all that tea overboard. 300 boxes of tea get thrown overboard. The deal with this that you may not know is that the act specified it wasn't necessarily because the tea was taxed. That had actually been repealed. The British East India Company designated that tea could only be sold by specific officers designated by the company. So in other words, now, if you were a merchant selling tea, you can't sell tea anymore. It's not such a big deal, really, except for the fact that people were very concerned that this would spread to other commodities, and all of a sudden the British companies and even the British government have a monopoly on what's being sold in your town. And it would theoretically, if taken to the extreme, it would eliminate independent merchants. So now if you were a merchant, well, you can't sell tea, you can't sell this, you can't sell that, because the British government says you can. So that is what had people really furious and in an uproar. And when it became apparent that the Tea Act wasn't going to be repealed, they dumped the tea in Boston. 3 days later, December 19, 1773, you get the Marshfield Tea Party. I bet you haven't heard of the Marshfield Tea Party. It is, to the best of my knowledge, the only other place in the province of Massachusetts Bay where tea was destroyed in this fashion. Patriots of Marshfield had followed a similar course to what the Sons of Liberty did in Boston. They confiscated the tea from various merchants in Marshfield. They held it in various places, mostly in John Bourne's Tavern, or also called the Old Ordinary. They also kept some of it in Deacon Nehemiah Thomas's house. They basically kept it under lock and key so that this tea could not be sold in Marshfield. Well, on December 19, the Patriots in Marshfield decide it's time for that tea to go. Nobody's going to sell it. So they go into the Old Ordinary, they take all the tea out of the cellar of the Old Ordinary, they go into Nehemiah Thomas's house. This is led by Benjamin White and Jeremiah Lowe, who were the two most prominent patriots in Marshfield. And they haul all this stuff out. This is the Old Ordinary, well, this part of it right here. It looks like a strip mall, right? I mean, but this part of it is actually one of the oldest buildings in Marshfield. This part right here was the Old Ordinary, John Bourne's Tavern. Goes back to the 17th century. At some point they added on and extended it to make all those stores. I think this is a breakfast place now. You can go in and have breakfast in the Old Ordinary. So they hauled all the tea out of there. They brought it up to a nearby hill. There's a boulder on the hill which had kind of a flat top. They dumped all the tea on the top of that rock, burned the tea, and from there on after, that rock was called Tea Rock, and the hill was called Tea Rock Hill. Tea Rock is gone. It was demolished when they developed the area to put some houses there. But Tea Rock Hill still bears that name, and nobody really knows why it's called Tea Rock, or Tea Rock Hill, but that's why. There is a little marker at the side of the road proclaiming this Tea Rock Hill. That marker, I don't think anybody notices it. It's very. I had a very difficult time finding this marker. It's along 3A right in Marshfield Center. So that's the Marshfield Tea Party. All right, well, things start to heat up now because, and I should mention a little bit about the fallout from the Marshfield Tea Party. I told you that Marshfield was mostly a Tory town. It really, according to a vote that was taken in town, I think it was about 50-50. And I'll tell you about that vote. The fact that there were so many loyalists in Marshfield, they would not let this burning of the tea stand. That would not stand in a loyalist town. These people were going to be punished and held accountable for what they did. So Marshfield had a town meeting, and there was one individual, the leader really of the Tories in Marshfield, who was pushing punitive action against those people who destroyed the tea. And this was Squire Nathaniel Ray Thomas. This was a very wealthy man. His estate was just probably the wealthiest estate in this region of Massachusetts. He raised cattle. Pretty much anybody who bought beef around here in Plymouth County, most of the beef came from Nathaniel Ray Thomas's farm. That's going to be a problem for a few people a little later on that I'll get to. So Nathaniel Ray Thomas is really pushing this in Marshfield town meeting. We need to punish these people who burnt the tea. So Marshfield actually passes an ordinance in town meeting to tax themselves for the damage that was done to the tea. It's a very peculiar thing. You could get out of the tax if you signed a letter basically proclaiming that you were a loyalist. If you signed a letter saying that you were against the burning of the tea, you could get out of the tax. But the patriots who would not sign that letter could not get out of that tax. Now, we have no evidence of whether or not that tax was actually collected, and in a couple of years, the point would become moot anyway as the war started. But it's very peculiar that they actually had this. The town meeting basically passed an ordinance to punish their own townspeople. Unusual act. That passed by one vote. One vote. So that gives you, I think, a good idea. That would tell you the actual split of loyalists versus patriots in Marshfield. I think it was that close. I think it was really, really pretty 50-50. And the patriots did afterwards, led by Nehemiah Thomas and Jeremiah Lowe and Benjamin White, the patriots of Marshfield did circulate a letter afterwards saying that this was a horrible thing that Marshfield had done by punishing its own inhabitants. So the patriots were loud and clear that no, there is a strong patriot presence in Marshfield, so that really should be noted. All right, but now you've got things really heating up, and loyalists and patriots in all these towns are really almost coming to blows. And so now you've got in towns that are overwhelmingly patriot, like Duxbury, you've got Tories who are being treated rather roughly, and a lot of them made to apologize for their views. Right here in Duxbury, we had Colonel Gamaliel Bradford, who's on the left, and Briggs Alden, Lieutenant Colonel Briggs Alden, who's on the right there. They were both justices of Plymouth County. Justices were appointed by the king. When Thomas Gage came in 1774 and became royal governor in Massachusetts, the justices of Plymouth County sent him a letter basically saying, congratulations on you. Now, most patriots regarded Gage's arrival, a military governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, most patriots regarded his arrival as a calamity. The justices of Plymouth County, who were appointed, they were royal officials and wanted to keep their positions, sent Gage a letter saying, congratulations, we're so glad you're here. We will do whatever we can to work with you. Well, you can imagine how that letter went over when the patriots in Duxbury read that letter. Now, these are influential men, not really likely to be treated brutally. I think the town wanted to treat these gentlemen with more respect, but they were made to stand up in front of a town meeting and publicly apologize. And that took place on September 19, 1774. Bradford and Alden were both forced to read the following message, that the letter that went out to Gage, I acknowledge I voted for which I am sorry from my heart and humbly ask the forgiveness of the town of Duxbury and all the inhabitants of the province. And I likewise promise and declare upon the true faith of a Christian that I will not take a commission nor act upon any under this new plan of government if offered to me. So, and they were true to their word. Because both of them became officers Alden became an officer in the militia. Bradford became an officer in the Continental Army. And in fact, he was at Valley Forge and in the Monmouth campaign. Bradford became a significant soldier from Duxbury. So from King's men to eventually Continental Army soldiers. So tarring and feathering. When I was a kid, I don't know if you saw it. Tarring and feathering had this sort of humorous kind of depiction to it cartoons and things. I mean, I honestly remember seeing Bugs Bunny cartoons and things with tarring and feathering. I mean, it was made out to be a funny thing. It is not a funny thing. Tarring and feathering is most likely to kill a person. I mean, you're getting boiling tar dumped over you. The feathers are thrown on just for amusement factor, I guess. But this is a brutally painful thing. Being ridden on a rail, that was common treatment for loyalists as well. So this is what, now we don't have any evidence of tarring and feathering in Duxbury or in the towns around here that I know of. I do know of some evidence, horrible story that I will not tell you, of tarring and feathering in Barnstable. I think that's the closest example that I know of. But there were forced recantations in front of Liberty polls. Loyalists made to apologize. And there was some pretty tough treatment, and probably the most famous one is the case of Jesse Dunbar. And Dunbar's story, Jesse Dunbar had bought, he was a gentleman from Halifax, and he had bought cattle from Nathaniel Ray Thomas, the leading Tory of Marshfield. Well, to support Nathaniel Ray Thomas, to do business with Nathaniel Ray Thomas, that was just asking for trouble from the Patriots. So Jesse Dunbar brought these cattle to Plymouth to be slaughtered. People in Plymouth found out that the cattle were from Nathaniel Ray Thomas. They went after Jesse Dunbar. I'm not going to get into specifics here because it gets pretty gory, but to make a long story short, they basically took one of the cattle, put Dunbar inside the carcass of the cattle, loaded the cattle and Dunbar onto a cart and carted him back to Nathaniel Ray Thomas's estate. And the Plymouth folk delivered him to the Kingston border, where he was charged a fee for his travels. And then the Kingston folk delivered him to the Duxbury border, where he was again charged a fee, and onward. Captain Waite Wadsworth of a Duxbury malicious company, malicious, they were malicious, of militia company, Wadsworth actually took pity on Dunbar, let him get out and walk alongside the cart until Dunbar, very foolishly, there were some children who were dancing around him and teasing him, and Dunbar tripped one of the kids. Not a wise move. Back in the cab he went, until he was dumped out at Nathaniel Ray Thomas's estate. Now, Nathaniel Ray Thomas wasn't there, but Mrs. Thomas was. And Seth Sprague of Duxbury, who went on to become a very prominent merchant here in Duxbury. Seth Sprague of Duxbury was 14 years old at the time, and he wrote a reminiscence in which he said, Mrs. Thomas, he remembers being there and seeing Mrs. Thomas. He said she was a well-informed, prudent, discreet woman. She opened her front window and addressed the company in such a manner as I have reason to think made some of them, at least, very much ashamed. I'd love to know what she said. He said, although it was good fun for me to follow Dunbar with tripe on his head, I got somewhat frightened before I got home. Some of the men began to talk of paying Uncle Phineas a visit, meaning my father. One of them observed that he expected his pot, meaning his head, his pot would split before spring. I fully understood what they meant. So these Duxbury men are threatening Sprague's father. Why? Because Sprague's father had bought beef from Nathaniel Ray Thomas. That's about all it took to get you in trouble with the Patriots, was to have any dealings with these loyalists whatsoever. All right, so I mentioned recantations in front of, and that, by the way, that's the earliest photograph I know of the Nathaniel Ray Thomas estate. Beautiful photograph that comes to us through the Daniel Webster estate in Marshfield. You can see the core of the original house here. You can kind of strip away all the Victorian embellishments, and you can imagine what the core of the original Georgian house looked like right here. So a very fine estate which was bought in the 1830s by Daniel Webster, and that became Daniel Webster's house. Burned in 1878, and they rebuilt the very Victorian house that's there now, but that's the property. So the Liberty Pole, Duxbury's Liberty Pole. Don't know exactly when it went up. I've tried to find out. It could have been anywhere between 1773 and a decade later, 1783, sometime during the war. But we do know, according to several sources, that there were recantations in front of the Duxbury Liberty Pole. We do know, according to several sources, that it was located on the hill near Colonel Gamaliel Bradford's house. This is Captain Gamaliel Bradford's house, his son. That house was not there at the time, but this is roughly the location of the Colonel's house, which doesn't exist anymore. This is the hill by the Colonel's house. There's also a hill south of the house, so it's somewhere around here. So we don't know the exact location, but it's somewhere on this ridge that runs to the west of the Gamaliel Bradford house. And Justin Windsor, early historian of Duxbury, boasted that there were no loyalists in Duxbury, that no Duxbury folk were actually hauled to the Liberty Pole to make recantations. There may have been no Duxbury recantations in front of the Liberty Pole, but I kind of doubt that there were no Duxbury loyalists. There were probably some very quiet ones, but no. What they did do, however, and we have evidence of this, they would kind of go into Marshfield and more or less urge some Marshfield loyalists to take a ride with them and come down to Duxbury and make a recantation in front of the Duxbury Liberty Pole. And this was done. We have the names of several of them, at least 3 or 5 that were done, and there were probably more. So this was probably the site not only of the recantations, but Sons of Liberty protests and meetings and gatherings. I wish we knew exactly where it was. I'm gonna kind of skip over the story of the rock, but during this period, to make a long story short, the Sons of Liberty in Plymouth decided that they wanted to move Plymouth Rock up to the Liberty Pole in Town Square. You know Town Square in Plymouth, where the 2 churches are that face each other there, the Stone Church and the White Church. They wanted to drag Plymouth Rock, a wonderful symbol that was embedded in a wharf down in Plymouth at the time, drag it up to Town Square. Well, wouldn't it have been easier to bring the Liberty Pole down to Plymouth Rock? I really don't understand why they did this. But sure enough, they lash up Plymouth Rock with teams of oxen. They haul it out of the wharf where it's embedded. And as that happens, it breaks in 2. And people are horrified, thinking, what have we done? And somebody yells out, well, it's a symbol of our break with England. And everybody cheers, and they're all happy. They let the bottom part roll back into the wharf where it stayed for quite some time. Yeah. And the top part was dragged to Town Square. Eventually it was dragged, in 1834, it was dragged over to Pilgrim Hall Museum, and when they had it on the cart to bring it over to Pilgrim Hall Museum, it rolled off the cart and split again. This seam, I don't know if you can see it in this picture, but there's sort of a cement seam down, and that's from 1834 when it split that time. So, poor Plymouth Rock, but it was in Town Square for quite some time, from 1774 to 1834. There's Nathaniel Ray Thomas from a miniature that is in the collection of the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society. So, as things get more tense, ultimately they came for Nathaniel Ray Thomas. And when I say they came, I mean a lot of people came. According to a source that was in a Boston newspaper, and I don't know, take this with a grain of salt, but according to a source in a Boston newspaper, a mob of 2,000 people from all the towns surrounding here went after Nathaniel Ray Thomas. And the idea was to get him and lynch him. Nathaniel Ray Thomas got word of it beforehand. And this was This was in September 6, 1774. So we're just half a year now away from war. Nathaniel Ray Thomas escaped to Boston. When he was in Boston, he encouraged General Gage. He said, you know, the Loyalists in Marshfield, we are at the mercy of these maniacs. Our lives are in danger. You've got to send a detachment of the King's troops down to Marshfield to protect us and to keep these patriots from destroying our property and even destroying our lives. Gage was delighted. It was the first time, and to the best of my knowledge, it is the only time in the history of the province of Massachusetts Bay that any town ever asked General Gage for help. It was, and he noted that. He just said, he was so pleased. Gage said to the inhabitants of Marshfield, the Loyalists in Marshfield who requested the King's troops, he said, I return to you my most hearty thanks for your address, and I assure you that I feel great satisfaction in having contributed to the safety and protection of a people so eminent for their loyalty to their king. At a time when treason and rebellion is making such hasty strides to overturn our most excellent constitution and spread ruin and desolation through the province. These troops who landed on January 13, 1775, a company of the 4th Regiment of Foot, about 100 men, landed at the North River, as I say, in January 1775. They marched through the town of Marshfield. School children later wrote, Marshfield school children later wrote of seeing them march by the schoolhouse and remembered how shiny their bayonets were. They marched to the farm of Nathaniel Ray Thomas, and there they set up a garrison. They brought 2 cannon with them and 300 muskets to be used by the gentlemen of Marshfield, the Loyalists, in defending themselves. So this is a formidable force that is now at the Nathaniel Ray Thomas estate. And this is the force that patriots in Duxbury are going to have their eye on when shots are fired. This is the force that they're going to be going after. I have a photo of the Edward Winslow House here in Plymouth because the captain of that British company, a Captain Nesbitt Balfour, he would make frequent visits to Edward Winslow, who was a Tory in Plymouth. And he would frequently consult with Winslow and some of Winslow's friends in Plymouth, other Tories in Plymouth. There were a decent number of Tories in Plymouth. He would consult with Winslow about sending a detachment of troops to Plymouth. And Winslow and his friends said, absolutely do not do it. They will fight like devils. They will tear you to pieces here. He did not station troops in Plymouth. But on April 19, in April 19, 1775, of course, he gets shots fired in Concord, and word reaches Duxbury and the towns around here in the afternoon of April 19, the militia and minute companies in these towns gather on the evening of April 19. We understand that it's not exactly known where they gathered, but we do know that on the night of April 19, there was a council of war. The commanding officer was a Colonel Theophilus Cotton from Plymouth. Briggs Alden, who lived in the house at the time, was second in command of this regiment. The troops may have actually been gathered in this vicinity. We just don't know. I'd kind of like to know where the troops spent that night. But we know that there was a council of war in the house, and they decided not to march to Marshfield that night on April 19. They would wait another day, get up in the morning, and see what happened. On the morning of April 20, they actually marched the regiment to the farm of a patriot, leading patriot, in Marshfield, the Colonel Anthony Thomas house. No relation to Nathaniel Ray Thomas. There were actually 2 completely different Thomas families. Colonel Anthony Thomas, the Plymouth County Regiment gathered on April 20, 1775, around this house, and as the officers debated, do we attack? More minute companies began to come in from Rochester and Plympton and other places. Crews of fishing vessels joined them. Theophilus Cotton probably had a force on April 20th of about 500 men to Balfour's 100 men, and yet Cotton did not attack. And I don't blame him. I mean, this is a strange situation. What do? Do you just hope that they're going to get on ships and go away? I think that's what Cotton was hoping. Are we really at war? What's going on here? I mean, I'm sure there was a lot of confusion, a lot of ambivalence. Waited another day, April 21, 1775. Still, no commands, no orders, no action. And the captain of the Kingston Company, Peleg Wadsworth, got so impatient that he actually advanced his Kingston Company without orders to within firing range of the British garrison, but did not advance. And as it turned out, the garrison was gone. Balfour had made his arrangements, and they were loaded on sloops and taken back to Boston. So shots were never fired. The almost Battle of Marshfield around, that's the marker at the Thomas House. The almost Battle of Marshfield never happened at the Nathaniel Ray Thomas House, but nearly did. And that's what the estate looks like today. Some of you may have been there.
Very much.